So he says the first thing we want to look at is the nature of morality. What in the world is it, right? And so he goes on to help us to explain what that's all about.
Yeah. Yeah, the obligation is relative to persons, so that's kind of where we're at, and it seems like we've made our bed and now we have to lay in it. We've kicked out the theology department and the old school philosophers who want to define nothing 6 ways from Sunday, and so you have even Christian philosophers saying, well, now that the atheists have taken over, we have to kind of redefine our terms because of what they're bringing to the table, and so there are definitions that we have to make sure that we either get right or that we're understanding that the old way that we have of kind of our Western ideas. Once kind of Christianity has done on the downslope especially in academics, then we have to make sure that we're actually talking about what both sides are talking about.
Yeah, and again, we have to understand the radicalness of the claim that he's making here, right? In other words, there's no such thing as objective moral values. We determine, even with morality, especially if naturalism is right, what is valuable. So what does that do to morality? Everybody has their own morality. Everybody can do whatever because they determine it. You know what?
Yeah.
It's radical. It's a radical claim.
Right. Yeah. Everyone does what's right in his own eyes. I think that's somewhere in some book somewhere that. So we bring in terms such as consequentialism, which Elizabeth Anscombe, a Christian philosopher from even back in the kind of the 60s era.
Yeah, I'm not sure if she was a Christian philosopher, but anyway.
A philosopher who may or may not have identified as a Christian. There you go. She talks about having concepts of obligations and duties, these moral claims of right and wrong, of oughts and shoulds that are should kind of be done away with because kind of the atheists have taken over. And so terms like ought, should, or need relate to good or bad things. And so we tend to think of them more now in prudential forms, as in they're good for you to do. Like as we did a few episodes ago of brushing your teeth. It's good for you to brush your teeth because you want good hygiene or you care about other people around you and stuff like that. But the problem arises when we conflate the prudential sense with a moral sense. So again, we're in a universe thinking here where naturalism is true, and so we're having to go back and say, okay, let's make sure we have a distinction then between, is it good as in good for you, or is it good as in kind of a universal good? And there are some problems that arise when we conflate those things.
Right. So the prudential sense has to do with kind of a conditional type of situation. So, for instance, your car, you have to put oil in it. Mm-hmm. So here's a prudential sense. If I desire my car to run well, then I need to put oil in it. Right. So that's just a practical type of thing, but it's based on my desires, my wants, that sort of thing. So that's what he's getting at here with regard to the prudential sense, right?
Right. So how did this come about? It's the answer is because history has said that from Aristotle to Christianity, we have this law conception of ethics. Christianity derives its ethical notions from the Torah. In consequences of the dominance of Christianity for many centuries, the concepts of being bound, permitted, or excused became deeply embedded in our language and thought. And so that's why we have this new and late subjective value that have come about. So we're kind of still operating in that old, when we say, oh, it's good, we have this notion in our minds is we don't always separate what that good means, and so we want to be clear in our definition.
Yeah, it's based on the law, right? So the law comes from people, and we have to obey it, or the moral law comes from God, and we have to obey it. So this kind of relationship between law and God, moral law and God, is what she's getting at.
Right. She says that moral sense or obligation can't coherently survive outside a religious context. Outside a context that counterants a divine moral law. And so she explains that the situation, if she's right, was an interesting one of the survival of concepts outside the framework of thought that made it really an intelligible one. So, kind of without a lawgiver talking about the law as in a universal objective law, doesn't really make any sense anymore. And so before that, before Christianity kind of arose in the ranks, you always had questions on, like, if you go back to the Greeks of what is love for country, and so you have, the Ciceros of the world talk about, do you pledge allegiance to the people of a state, or what's the difference between that and pledging to the state, or you have kind of a Machiavellian sense of what is the best desire for a king to have? Is it to do his will and carry it out through kind of any means necessary, although Machiavelli kind of gets a bad rap sometimes, and he's hated on because sometimes he just talks in a prudential form, sometimes to the detriment of lives. But we need to realize that when people use these terms, that we can't interchange them from what we're talking about with good.
Right. And then she says the Enlightenment came.
Yeah,
right?
That darn Enlightenment.
Right. And so the Enlightenment, is an attempt then to justify moral laws apart from God,
right,
apart from the divine law.
Right. And so since we're not hitching it to the lawgiver, we need to recognize that it's being grounded purely in human custom. That is, prior to the rise of Christianity, virtually anyone, including philosophers, had thought of right and wrong as corresponding to what is permitted and what is forbidden by tradition, custom, or law. In short, the rules that are of human origin, whether written or unwritten. So we kind of think of the rules of baseball. Those are objective standards. Right. Well, you know that if you're 12 runs up, you shouldn't steal second. And so if you steal second, then the pitcher's going to bean your next batter. Well, hold on. Where's that written in the rule book? Well, it's not. There's, this unwritten rule that you shouldn't do it. It's bad sportsmanship. And so bad sportsmanship requires divine strike of a 96-mile-an-hour fastball to the chin. So morality now went beyond obedience to merely, and this is describing Christianity, morality now went beyond obedience to merely human laws, customs, tradition, and came to be thought of instead as obedience to divine law, which then you have people then describing goods and bads as being objectively good and bad, because you have, like the computer programmer says, I'm writing a basic computer language, and if 1 + 1 returns 2, that's good, because you're following what I've designed you to do. But if it comes out to be 3, then he's got to tweak the code because there's something within the code that's bad, meaning that it's returning false information from a universal concept of the creator's mind. So who is it that thus permits, forbids, or requires that these things are done or not done? As we saw prior to Christianity, it was merely we who did these things. Mm-hmm. The Christian West, God usurped mankind as the lawgiver, and over the centuries we've become accustomed to thinking that questions of right and wrong and obligations are independent of us, and it would, for example, be wrong to torture someone in order to gain some mild pleasure, regardless of what humans believed. But this is the theistic view. So where do we have this concept of other people? Because if the desire is to feel good or to be good, then that definition might change depending on what my stated goal is. Mm. So there's 2 ways to make sense of our deeply ingrained belief in morality and human independence. Mm. One is to maintain the person-relative aspect of the law, to continue to ground them in the supernatural person.
Right.
So that's
we say that God grounds law.
Right.
Grounds the moral law.
Right. So if we're...
he's a person, and persons are valuers, and therefore what he values then becomes the moral law.
Right. So all deists have this concept of, even if it's the blind watchmaker has wound up the watch and left, but there's still that imprint of, how he's created the universe. So even if there's maybe a less structured version like Christianity that comes about, a general deist might have understandings of laws of logic and laws of science ability because of who God is. So they're able to ground it in that. The other is to reject the personal grounds altogether and ground them in nature.
Right. So we either ground them in the supernatural God,
right,
or we ground them in nature.
Right. So it's either a part of the universe and we're discovering them because they're objective truths, like we're discovering gold in the ground. We don't just all of a sudden come up with the idea of gold once we're digging and it appears suddenly. It's there and we're digging up, or we're putting the rock we're discovering the rock and we say, ooh, that rock that glitters, that's gold, and we value it. And so it's just right and wrong are just parts of the fabric of nature itself, however inherently implausible this bizarre supposition may seem. So part of the divine, or is it part of nature?
Right. So there's some, I don't know, particle that's morally good that we're trying to find or something like that. Right?
The Higgs boson
of morality.
Of murder. a great whodunit of particle physics or something like that. Yeah.
So we're either grounded in God or the cosmos, he tells us, right? And modern philosophers took up the search for a way to ground morality objectively, without having to deal with God, right? In other words, they wanted to try to ground it in nature.